Welcome to today's module, Stress Management. With a plan, you can win the morning each day. The primary source of this information comes out of our required textbook of Weinberg and Gold, Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 7th edition. The learning objectives of this course are to help us improve our coping skills so we can improve our performance. First, we want to be able to identify stress as a process. We'll be able to differentiate between stress, anxiety, and arousal. We want to be able to identify coping strategies for managing stress. And lastly, we want to learn how to reframe our perception of stress by being able to explain the 4C model. So before we go too much further, ask yourself, how does stress in your life impact your performance? Is it helpful or facilitative, or is it debilitative, or is it decreasing your performance or persistence through an activity or task? It's important that as much as we expend physical energy, it's oftentimes the mental energy we spend on managing stress, anxiety, and arousal is what really causes us to feel fatigue, muscle tension, lack of concentration, and just overall a decrease in performance. So let's begin exploring how we can manage our mental energy. Well, there's three main terms that we're going to be exploring this week, and it is stress, anxiety, and arousal. Now, it's important that we differentiate between these because even though they all interact together, they all are a separate component of being able to manage and cope with stress. Throughout this module, I want you to keep in mind there's a few key points. First is that stress is a process or a sequence of events that will actually lead us to a particular end. Stress increases when we lack perceived ability to meet the task demand, especially when failure has negative consequences. Anxiety is really just a negative emotional state in which feelings of nervousness, worry, and apprehension are associated with the activation of arousal of the body due to this stress. And then arousal is really just a general physiological and psychological activation that varies on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. And it is these three concepts that we'll explore to understand how we can manage our stress better. So how are stress, arousal, and anxiety different? Well, stress differs from arousal and anxiety, and that is a byproduct of when we feel that we're not capable of completing a task successfully, especially when failure has consequences, such as taking an exam that if you fail will lead to an undesirable grade, or in sport, something like missing a free throw at the end of a game that leads to your team losing that game. Stress is increased when we place too much importance on the outcome of an event, and or when we have a goal orientation that's more outcome versus task goal oriented. We see typically with those that are outcome oriented tend to feel more stress when we perceive that the desired outcome isn't going to be possible. Whereas if you are task-oriented and not worried as much about the outcome, you're focused more in the moment about the things that need to be done or that you need to take care of in order to manage the stress. So essentially, we define stress as that imbalance between the task demand and our perceived ability of completing that task successfully, especially when failure has consequences. So now that we understand stress as the imbalance between task demand and perceived ability, and especially when there are consequences for our actions and outcomes, it's important that we also define stress as a process. And this process has 4 stages. Stage 1 is the environmental demand. Stage 2 is understanding the perception of that demand. Stage 3 is what is our stress response to that demand. And lastly is what are those behavioral consequences, or what is our performance like when we've gone through this process? So in this first stage, it's really all about the environment. What is the mental and physical demands of the event? A physical demand of an event may be just when a physical education student has to execute a newly learned skill in front of the class. And an example of a psychological demand of the environment would be when parents put pressure on you or put pressure on a young athlete to win a race or perform well. Think about the different types of environments that we're in. We're in social environments, school, work, sport. And we have different demands in each one of these areas. By understanding the environment and what parts of the environment are causing stress can help us identify ways and come up with strategies to help deal with that stress. The second stage in the stress process is really about how we perceive the demands. And do we perceive the demands of the event as threats, both physically and or psychologically? These threats come from our own expectations or expectations of others, the workload that we're under, what sort of assessments and or exams do we have to take to have desired outcomes, especially in academics like grades. And then it's also the judgment of others that we'll perceive as threats at times. And this is where a person's level of trait anxiety will greatly influence how that person perceives the world around them. Those with high trait anxiety tend to perceive more situations, especially ones that are evaluative or competitive, as threatening, and they view that more than people that have lower trait anxiety. And for this reason, trait anxiety is an important influence in stage 2 of the stress process. In stage 3, this is where we have our stress response. This is cognitive and physiological activation to the event. And this is where our perception of the demand and our perceived ability really come into play. And this is where we determine, am I capable of completing the task successfully? In stage 3 of viewing stress as a process is where we see the stress response. This is cognitive and physiological activation to the event. If you perceive the event as something you cannot do, so now you feel there's an imbalance between task demand and your perceived ability, you're going to feel threatened. And especially in evaluative and competitive situations, that feeling gets heightened with your stress response. This is when you have the increased heart rate and breathing, you feel the butterflies in your belly, the muscles tense up, and your attentional focus tends to get really narrow the more you get stressed and the more your anxiety and arousal raises. And this is where self-awareness is critical, because it's this part of the process that we can incorporate many strategies even within the performance or within the event to help us cope with that increased stress. The final stage of defining stress as a process is really a culmination of the previous 3 stages: the environmental demand, the perception of those demands as threats, and then our response to all that stress, the physiological and psychological response. And so this is where we see our behavior, and this has a huge impact on our performance. We can have either a positive impact or a negative impact. And the thing that really separates the two often is our coping mechanisms and our coping skills. With good coping skills, we can increase our effort, decrease that anxiety, be in an optimal zone of functioning and optimal arousal state. We stay more focused, and we will persist through adversity greater than if we do not have good coping skills. So the opposite is true if you do not have good coping skills. And what are some of these negative behavioral consequences? Well, procrastination, late to meetings, late with tasks. You're often overly emotional about things. When the pressure's on, we tend to get tight, or we become overly aggressive or defensive. Oftentimes, you see, especially in the workplace, people that are overly stressed, they're feeling ill all the time, but they feign it to the degree that they just don't want to show up. They don't want to be a part of it because the stress is too much. Lastly, especially on the athletic competitive field, we see poor body language and avoidance behavior. And this is a key indicator that the pressures of the stress and anxiety and arousal are too great, and we need to step in and help these individuals learn coping mechanisms so they can perform better, feel better about themselves, and have better outcomes. So being able to define stress and understand it as a process, it's also important that we understand that there's several different sources of stress. And there's 2 primary sources. There's situational and personal sources of stress. Now, earlier we talked about personal sources such as trait anxiety. Also, our self-esteem is a key in determining how much stress we'll be under. Another one is the social physique anxiety. Now, this is exhibited when individuals don't feel good about their appearance, and so they tend to shy away or avoid physical activity because they're worried about what others may think of them. They're worried about how they feel about themselves from a physical standpoint. So those are all personal sources. And then from a situational standpoint, it's the event importance. Is this a championship game? Is this a league game? Is it a non-conference game? Is it a preseason game? Those all tend to be sources of stress, and they'll increase or decrease depending on the importance of it. And then also the outcome uncertainty. When you're uncertain about the outcome, it's difficult to feel good about yourself, and it adds that stress to the point where, again, when you have good coping mechanisms, that uncertainty of the event will not impact you as great as if you do not have good coping skills. A key point to remember is that high trait anxiety and low self-esteem are related to a heightened state anxiety reaction, especially in athletes. Okay, so now we know stress is the imbalance between task demand and perceived ability, especially when failure has consequences. Now let's define anxiety. Anxiety is essentially a negative or unpleasant state in reaction to the stress. It's often characterized by nervousness, worry, apprehension, and is associated with the activation of the arousal of our body. Now, this unpleasant psychological state reaction to our perceived stress impacts our performance, especially when under pressure. Now, anxiety has two components. There's a thought component known as cognitive anxiety and a physiological component known as somatic anxiety. It's important to know this because there are different strategies and coping mechanisms if we can identify, is it cognitive anxiety we're struggling with or somatic anxiety that we need to have strategies to help cope with. In addition to these two components of anxiety, it's also important that we distinguish between state and trait anxiety. Trait anxiety is essentially, how do you generally feel? Do you have high or low anxiety on a day-to-day basis? Whereas state anxiety is how you are feeling in the moment. Think about when you start an exam. Do you feel anxious or do you feel confident? What are your perceived threats? Being aware of your level of anxiety in the moment can help you determine if you need to use a specific strategy, whether cognitive or somatic, or maybe a little bit of both, to regulate your feelings of anxiety. In turn, regulating your emotional arousal and then your attentional focus, and all that leads to improved performance. So in an effort to improve our performance, it's important that we distinguish between somatic and cognitive anxiety because we have different coping skills and strategies that we need to implement when we experience these. Now, we're all very familiar with these signs and symptoms, but it's good to go back and review to remember which ones are the physiological responses and which ones are the cognitive responses. So, for instance, with the somatic anxiety of the shaky hands or nervousness and the overly emotional kind of reaction to the stress, we can use breathing techniques and muscle relaxation techniques to help us manage that stress and anxiety. Now, those techniques are different than what we would use for the cognitive anxiety, right? Because cognitive anxiety really deals with our concentration. And our concentration has a lot to do with our self-doubt, how we talk to ourselves, and if we're having, bad day, we'll probably have negative self-talk. And this leads to disorganized thoughts. And so with this type of anxiety, we would do more mindfulness training, more self-talk training to help us reframe how we view things in our heads so that we can have a more positive outlook on them and have better thoughts to help us concentrate more and focus on the task to improve our performance. So we've defined stress and anxiety. Now let's take a look at arousal. Now, arousal is a combination of these physiological and psychological activations caused by our anxiety due to the stress. Now, we got to remember that our arousal is always present to some extent, but it's not associated necessarily with a pleasant or unpleasant event in and of itself. And it's essentially on a spectrum from very low, where you're sleeping or comatose, to very high, where you have intense excitement. And really what arousal refers to is the intensity of motivation. Are you psyched up or are you flat? Those are two common terms that you typically hear in athletics. Now, it's important that we are self-aware of our arousal and understand when we perform our best. Now, some people perform well when their arousal is high, while others need low arousal. And it also depends on the situation. So again, taking that interactional approach, understanding your personality traits along with the situational demands will help us understand what is our optimal arousal state. And that's really the goal of psychological skills training and coping mechanisms, is to help us maintain focus, decrease our muscle tension so we have coordinated movements, be able to have the right kind of concentration so that our visual search patterns are taking in the cues that are necessary and not taking in too many cues and getting distracted or being so overly aroused that our concentration in our visual search pattern becomes so narrow that we actually miss the relevant cues to help us be successful in an event. Okay, so throughout this module, we've been talking about coping strategies and how to handle stress and anxiety to regulate our arousal. So what are these strategies and how can I improve my coping ability to improve my performance? Before we go into actual coping strategies and those mechanisms, let's take a real broad look. First, we need to get help. We need to get help by asking others, by learning from others, and by even doing some of our own research. Remember that getting help is not a sign of weakness, that you're not alone, that we all need it. And you can get help from friends, from teachers, from coaches, from psychologists, from those that have dealt with the coping strategies and have their own strategies. And there's multiple strategies out there. So there's not one strategy that's going to fit in a cookie cutter scenario, but rather we have to explore all the options to us in the areas of goal setting, arousal regulation, self-talk and concentration, and imagery. So we need to be able to prep, plan, and take action, right? So we need to become educated on coping strategies so we can prepare strategies to help us combat the stress that we find ourselves in. Understanding stress as a process will help you break down the cause of your stress, be able to make a plan, and take action to cope with the somatic and cognitive anxiety that, in essence, will enable us to regulate our arousal to give us what we want, which is an improved concentration and improved task performance. In addition to getting help, prepping, planning, and taking action, it's imperative that we actually reframe our perception of stress. Oftentimes, it's that we view stress as this really bad thing. So we're going to take a look at the 4C model later in this module to help us understand how using that model will enable us to reframe how we view stress. So what are some ways to get help and become more self-aware? Well, there's campus resources here on Long Beach State. You might use your personal insurance for your mental health services. You might also just want to pay attention to what's causing the stress, like become more self-aware of your environment and those threats that you feel, right? And what are your behaviors, that are coming from that stress response, right? Talk to others. Obviously, it's great to have social support. It's part of feeling that we belong to a community. And then we need to improve our competence in this by reading, listening, and researching on our own to understand how we can improve our performance by regulating our arousal. So in addition to getting help, we need to be able to prep, plan, and take action. We need to take that education and the advice we get from others and prepare ourselves for the event, so to speak, and prepare ourselves for stressful situations. We need to plan practice of these coping mechanisms because just like a physical skill, where you would practice the physical skill before you get into a competitive event, the same thing needs to happen with our mental skills. We need to practice them in situations that are less stressful so that we can get into the habits of using these techniques when it's less stressful, and then when we are in stressful situations that we'll rely back on those coping strategies. And that's what we mean by taking action. We need to take action. We need to be intent when we are under stressful situations. So we must approach stress with intention to combat it. Otherwise, it will very much overwhelm us. And sometimes, even when we use the best evidence-based practices with our coping strategies, we'll still feel overwhelmed. Just remember, you're not alone. right? Some of these coping strategies that you can implement on a day-to-day basis really come down to setting goals and prioritizing your day. When you have self-talk, when you find yourself under stress, recognize when you're being negative and change that into more positive, instructional, and motivational self-talk. Make sure that if you don't already have morning routines and midday routines and evening routines, that you're developing routines that help you feel consistent. It's within these routines that can help us refocus our mind and concentrate back on the moment. Additionally, imagery and mindfulness are important components to our psychological well-being and our coping mechanisms. We can actually use imagery to be able to see the outcomes that we want before they even happen. And being mindful can just help us stay relaxed and give us that peaceful feeling when we're under a lot of stress. And then with arousal regulation, that is about making sure that we understand when we have cognitive and somatic anxiety and what strategies are we going to use to regulate that arousal. And sometimes we don't need to just regulate our arousal down. Sometimes we need to regulate our arousal up. And then never forget the importance of sleep. Oftentimes, especially as a student, sleep is something that we don't get enough of because we feel like we got to go, 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 go. We need to complete our academics. We need to complete our training. We need to complete all these things, and we feel like we have very limited time. This goes all the way back to setting goals and prioritizing things. Set up a timetable. Actually schedule your sleep if necessary, because just as your body needs recovery from physical stress on the body, our minds need that mental sleep and that mental recovery. Otherwise, again, we will just be overburdening ourselves with the workloads that we're under, and we won't be able to perform our best. So in an effort to help us manage our stress, we need to get help. We need to prep, plan, and take action. Then we need to also reframe our perception of stress. Oftentimes, we view stress in a very negative way. We need to begin to view stress as an opportunity for personal growth. Now, why should we change our view, and how can we? Those are two important questions we need to ask ourselves. Well, first question is why should we, is because it'll improve our health. Both physical and mental health will be improved by changing this view on stress. It'll also increase your stress capacity, meaning that you'll be able to handle more and more stresses in life and not be overwhelmed. And lastly, by being able to view things as an opportunity for personal growth, it'll help us persist through adversity, it'll increase our effort, and all those things will also improve our perceived ability, therefore improving our performance. So how can we change our view on stress? Well, we're going to take a look at the 4C model, and the 4C model essentially deals with mental toughness, but it can be directly applied to how we manage our stress. What is the 4C model, and how can we apply it to stress management? Okay, as implied in the name of the model, there's 4 C's: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. Now, control relates to the amount of tasks we have on our plate at any one time. And are we in control of all those to-dos, or are they controlling us? It's when we feel that they're controlling us is when our stress increases. Remember, it's when we feel that imbalance of task demand to perceived ability. And it really increases when there's negative consequences for failure. So when we take a look at our to-do list or at all the tasks we have to do, what are we in control of, and what are the things we're not in control of? Also, what are the things that should be high on the priority list as opposed to those that we're constantly doing, but they're not really helping us get to getting things cleared off our plate so much. So it's important to prioritize the tasks and then systematically go through it. So that's one way we can help manage our stress. Another way is through commitment. Now, commitment happens when we set goals. And it's through this commitment, especially during the tough times, that help us feel that we have more control of the situation. So by setting daily goals or weekly goals, or even some moderate to long-term goals, with managing all those tasks and things that we need to get done, will help us in managing our stress. Next, the challenge aspect of the 4C model is really where we reframe our view on stress. Oftentimes, we look at stress in a negative way. Yes, it has negative consequences. We can see all the ill health, all the health consequences of being under stress regularly are not good. And so we want to be able to improve our health. And we can do that by reframing how we view these challenges. And it's not as easy as it sounds, but if we can perceive those potential threats as opportunities for personal growth, and then we thrive during these situations, is when we're going to be able to reframe how we view stress. And it's in that, changing our mindset about seeing it as an opportunity for personal growth that will actually provide that ability to build our confidence that we can actually persist in the face of adversity. And it's having this confidence during setbacks or in challenging times and maintaining that belief in ourselves that is critical to continuing to manage stress. Because again, if we start feeling that we're not good enough or that we have too much on our plate, it's going to negatively impact the way we manage our stress. So we can use the 4C model and apply it to help us stay in control of the things that we need to do and prioritize the things that we need to do to feel successful. We'll be able to set goals and manage our stress and stay committed to those goals even in the face of challenges, because when we reframe stress as an opportunity for personal growth, we will then begin to thrive in these constantly changing environments that will simply build our confidence and our ability to manage stress even when we are facing adversity. That is the best way to be able to use the 4C model to help us manage stress and reframe the way we see it. Now that we've identified stress as a process, we've differentiated stress, anxiety, and arousal, we've identified some coping strategies, and we've discussed how we can apply the 4C model to managing this stress. This is all in an effort to help us win the morning. Now, win the morning is a phrase that gets to the heart of starting out each day in a way that we can handle the challenges we'll face with confidence. Now, the best way to do that is, again, to become self-aware. Educate yourself on the science of the stress and the coping strategies available to us. We need to be able to incorporate these coping strategies, whether they be self-talk, the routines, imagery, mindfulness, but also don't forget the importance of sleep and rest. Then we need to be able to reframe stress as an opportunity for personal growth. So we need to intentionally choose to manage our stress and not let our stress control us. By intentionally taking these steps, you'll feel more in control. You'll increase your competence. You'll increase your feeling of being in a community, especially if you talk to others, and it'll help remind you that you're not alone. All of these aspects of managing our stress will increase our self-determined behavior, our perceived ability, which we know will lead to greater performance, and our persistence through stressful times. We can all be 1% better every day. Thank you for your time, energy, and effort in completing this module. Please review the learning objectives before completing the module quiz. Good luck.